Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. We are here once again at the Eminent Wellness Center, and we are delivering our third installment of our six-part series. And it's a cannabis education series sponsored by Kemosabi. And of course, we want to say thank you to Kemosabi and to the great people at the Eminent Wellness Center for providing this space. We're going to dive into the history of cannabis today, and it's a long and sordid one. But before we dive into that, just want to issue our land acknowledgement, because at EducaNation, we are dedicated allies to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and we recognize the vast sovereign, unsurrendered, and treaty territories from the east to the west coast. And we acknowledge the First Peoples of Turtle Island to be the original and rightful land owners, land caretakers, and land healers to what we know to be Canada. And through an ever-growing network of partners and supporters, we at EducaNation sincerely aim to continually work and learn how to be diverse and responsive in supporting the various wellness needs of Indigenous communities. And we, for our fulfilling part of that declaration today, by issuing this education. And just want to share a little bit about who I am and why I'm here delivering this education today. I got into the cannabis education space after getting diagnosed with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer and being given 6 months to a year to live. And I wasn't really okay with that plan, so went searching for one of my own, and that's where I rediscovered the healing power of cannabis. And it absolutely transformed my life and my circumstances immediately after I started using it. So I became very passionate about learning and got educated at the Cannabis Institute, and I became certified as a cannabis health coach and educator. And then I joined EducaNation, a cannabis education nonprofit here in Canada that is dedicated to providing the highest standard of responsible cannabis education. And I started there as a member, and now I run it with my executive team. Always had a connection with plant medicine. I've been a chartered herbalist since 2005, dabbled with some different modalities on my healing journey, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, cannabis meditation, ceremony facilitation. And it's always been a dream of mine since I was a little girl to write a book. And I'm really proud to say that I have contributed to a book, the one you see on the far wall on the right and on the left of the screen. It's High Aspirations, Budding Dreams to Harvesting Hope, a commemorative look at Canadian cannabis. And it's a collaborative book where 33 other Canadians shared their stories about how they got into the cannabis industry. And then I just published my own book in March. It's High Hopes for Healing, Stigma-Free Education on Thriving Through Cancer with Cannabis. It's a book that I wish somebody would have handed to me after I got diagnosed. And it's my gift to anybody who is going through cancer and needs to learn how they would like to utilize cannabis. Really important to mention that, I do have letters after my name, but they're not MD or RN. I'm not a doctor or a nurse or a medical professional of any kind. I'm just a patient who had to navigate her own circumstances, and I'm just sharing with you the information that I have gathered over the years. Okay, so today we're going to learn a little bit about where and how cannabis has been used around the world. We can't talk about cannabis history without getting into prohibition and reefer madness, and we're going to talk about the social injustices during that time that have other minority. So we're going to start in ancient China around 2700 BC. That is around 5,000 years ago, and it's the time where the earliest recorded use of cannabis was documented. And it was done so by this fine-looking fellow here, the Emperor Shen Nung of China, who was actually known in legend to be the father of agriculture, herbal medicine, and modern farming. He did record the use of over 365 plants, including cannabis, and he recorded those in the Pensao Qing. That's that document you see on the bottom right. This is ancient Chinese text of healing remedies, and cannabis appears in this text as ma, which is a Chinese word meaning a plant with two forms, in particular male and female, also speaking to what we spoke about last month and the dioecious nature of the cannabis plant. The seeds of the cannabis plant were particularly revered as food and medicine, used in traditional Chinese medicine to serve the 5 viscera, meaning the heart, liver, spleen, lungs, and kidneys, and for supporting the flesh and energy. And the roots were also coveted for bone healing. So the little observation I made here is when you look at the Chinese name Ma. And if you look at the quote by Emperor Shennong on the screen, you can see that, the Chinese knew something that we teach today about the biphasic effects of cannabis. And that's just meaning that at low doses, cannabis can have one effect, where at high doses, it can have an opposite effect. And that is in particular with THC and CBD, and with the conditions of anxiety and sleep. So typically THC, small amounts can calm your nervous system. They can help support your sleep, but higher amounts have been known to overstimulate it and can lead to anxiety or disrupted sleep. And it's the same thing with CBD. It also has a biphasic effect where low doses tend to promote alertness and ease anxiety, while sometimes higher doses can be much more sedating and can actually induce anxiety. And this is not cannabis being dangerous. This is just cannabis being intelligent and teaching us relationship, dosage, and respect. So we're going to look still in China. We're here in the Yanghai tombs in Turpan, China, where researchers found 2,700-year-old a burial site with large cannabis plants in the tomb. And this tomb belonged to somebody who was believed to be a shaman or a healer, and suggesting that this plant was used with some reverence, used in ritual, maybe medicinally or for some spiritual purposes. We also find this wooden brazier on the far right. It's a fancy word for an incense burner. This one in particular was found in a cemetery in Western China, and around the same time frame as well, which suggests that this plant was possibly used in ritual or funeral type settings. Again, speaking to how it was potentially honored and respected. All right, so we're leaving China now, and we're moving into India. So oddly enough, you have heard cannabis referred to by the term sativa and indica, and the term indica literally means from India, but that does cause a little bit of confusion because that's not the actual fact of the matter. But early botanists were naming plants based on where they found them or received them at the time, and not necessarily where the plant originally evolved. In India, cannabis shows up in the Atharva Vedas, one of the 4 sacred texts of Hinduism, as one of the 5 sacred plants. It's often associated with joy, release from fear, and connection to the divine. Ayurvedic history records that cannabis was used to treat diseases of the nervous system. It was used to treat pain, insomnia, low appetite, poor digestion, and to heighten sexual libido. And there's an early story in cannabis about cannabis in Ayurveda, and it comes from one called The Churning of the Milky Ocean. And it goes a little like this. In their moment of despair, they started praying to Shiva in order to save everyone from a deadly poison. He drinks all of this poison despite it threatening to kill him. His throat was turning all blue, so his wife, Parvati, fearing the death of her husband, goes within to conjure the most powerful plants in all of creation. And which one does she specifically select? But the cannabis plant. She takes the cannabis plant, makes a paste out of the leaves, and then she makes it into a drink with milk, and she pours it into Shiva's throat. And the therapeutic compounds of the cannabis plant save Shiva from this deadly poison. So cannabis in India is deeply connected to Lord Shiva. Shiva is known as the Lord of destruction of illusion or ego, stillness and chaos, and of pure awareness. And Shiva is also referred to as the Lord of Bang, because he was known to consume it regularly to expand calm and clarity. And Bang is one of the oldest preparations that are still used by Indian people today. What Bang is a beverage that's usually made by grinding cannabis leaves or flowers into a paste and then mixing it with milk, spices, sometimes nuts, and a sweetener. You have your Bang lassi, traditional, just your ground cannabis leaves mixed with yogurt or milk, and your Bang Tandi, which is a little bit more jazzed up with some spices and nuts and seeds and herbs, and typically mixed with milk. Now, cannabis is illegal in most of India, but there are some times where it is legal to consume bang, and this is typically during these two festivals, either Holi or the Mahashivratri. I had a hard time with that one. The Shivaratri is actually a festival in honor of Lord Shiva, the great knight of Shiva, and bang is authorized to be sold and served and consumed by devotees. And it's also utilized during the Holy Festival of Color, where they consume bang to help them release and let go. Another interesting observation here is how the Indian people knew how to properly prepare cannabis to amplify its benefits by mixing it with a fat like milk or yogurt, because we know that cannabis is lipophilic, meaning it loves and binds to fat, making it more bioavailable and better absorbed by the body. All right, so India, we see cannabis as both medicine, sacred companion. It's prepared with care, attention, and understanding. And then as the plant travels across continents, it is adapting to new cultures, new needs, and new ways of being used. So we're in Egypt now, and in ancient Egypt, cannabis was often referred by the word Shemshemet. And although this is still largely under debate, most scholars believe this to be true at this time. Cannabis, it appears, and this word Shemshemet appears in many ancient Egyptian medical texts, including the Evers Papyrus from 1550 BCE, and it contains hundreds of healing remedies. And some researchers interpret many of these to involve cannabis. And the methods that they use were actually quite innovative. They were using cannabis for topical applications. They were using it for vaginal suppositories, and they were using it for cooling enemas. And each of these approaches allowed the plant to be used in targeted and intentional ways, and at the same time show us that smoking was not really as common in the early parts of history. When it came to utilizing cannabis, we were doing so internally. It was raw, infused, decocted, and extracted into oils and fats and applied topically or taken internally. In Egypt, we have Seshat, who is known as the goddess of writing, language, measurement, record keeping, architecture, and sacred knowledge. And she's often depicted as a scribe holding her writing instrument, wearing a panther skin dress, and a seven-pointed headdress above her head. Now, many modern historians suggest this symbol could represent a connection to the cannabis plant. Of course, we don't know for sure, but again, this is the common interpretation. All right, so we're moving now through Africa, and we're going into Central Africa, where once again, cannabis has a long and layered history. In different regions, it was known by different names, either Daga, Ganja, or Liamba, and each name did reflect a local relationship with the plant. Historical evidence shows, of course, cannabis, arrived at all these places through the trade routes from Asia and the Middle East. But here it didn't remain just a traded good. It became woven into the local healing practices, spiritual traditions, and the daily life. And in North Africa, cannabis was used by different communities for pain, for digestion, respiratory support, childbirth, and ritual. And then you have Southern Africa, where records show it was used for asthma, snakebite, dysentery, malaria, and labor pain. So we see the same pattern, not just one method and not just one purpose for this plant. It was adapted and used based on the needs of the place and the time. Here in Africa, we also have a lot of early evidence of these smoking technologies, a lot of water pipes similar to your modern day bong. They've been traced back to the 14th century in parts of Africa, and archaeological findings, including pipes with cannabis residue, were recovered in areas like Ethiopia, and suggest that this was used for social and ceremonial settings. And there were a lot of early water pipes found that likely evolved around the development of the hookah, but the bong is actually said to have originated here in Africa. All right, so we're moving once again into North America here. So this was a slide I kind of added at the last minute, but it did share some really important information that I wanted to share with you all, including some history of, indigenous uses of the cannabis plant after it had arrived here in North America. We have also like the Hopewell Mound builders who lived 400 BCE. And a lot of clay pipes were found in that area. A lot of hemp clothing and fibers were found at that time. We know that the Vikings relied on hemp for rope and sails and were here for a long time before early colonial settlers. We've talked a lot about that clay pipe from Morriston, Ontario. It was found by Bill Fitzgerald. Again, there's still a lot of debate around whether it's accurate or not, whether it was used by Indigenous peoples or not, but this information has been passed down. And the information that we keep coming across, so might be some truth to it. We're going to talk more about the 1600s and what the cannabis industry was like in the USA and then in Canada, where it was used for, hundreds, maybe thousands of years before that, as a medicine for various conditions. And so looking at North America, getting a little bit closer to home and time, and this was a time where cannabis wasn't overly controversial. It was actually quite useful and extremely necessary because European colonies were expanding overseas and they depended heavily on these natural materials, hemp being one of the most important because their ships needed strong rope and durable sails. Their communities needed clothing, paper, nets, and cordage, and hemp provided all of that. It was reliable, fast-growing, and incredibly versatile. And because of this, some colonies in the United States didn't just encourage hemp cultivation, they actually required it by law. It was law in places like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Farmers were legally obligated to grow an acre of hemp because it was essential to the economy and to the survival of the colony. Again, cannabis was infrastructure. From 1631 to the early 1800s, hemp was accepted as legal tender. So over 150 years there where it was such a valuable agricultural commodity that you could pay for things with it. President George Washington had over 100 hemp plants at Mount Vernon and was quoted to say, make the most you can of the Indian hemp seed and sow it everywhere. Thomas Jefferson, another former president, grew hemp and invented a hemp threshing machine, which received the first United States patent, something similar to what we call a decorticator today, a machine that will separate the fibers from the cannabis stalks. Benjamin Franklin's paper mill made paper with hemp fibers, and another former president, John Adams, wrote papers encouraging hemp production on hemp paper. So, and we all know that the American Constitution as well was written on hemp paper. So cannabis entered the United States pharmacopoeia in 1850. Don't know what took them so long, but there it was, and that meant that it was recognized at that time as a medicine. And it was so for until the late 1800s, early 1900s. At that time where it was so widely accepted, cannabis made up the ingredients in the top 3 pharmaceuticals that were prescribed at the time. So it just really seems like a contradiction in terms where, the same people that mandated this plant then worked so hard to prohibit our use of it. And not because the plant changed, but because the economic and political landscape did. Cannabis was later removed from the pharmacopoeia, not because it didn't work, but because it was really hard to fit the model that was emerging. So cannabis was hard to standardize. It was difficult to patent. Its effects were biphasic and individualized, which means they were really hard to standardize. And synthetic drugs were a lot easier to control, scale, and profit from. And that is exactly when the industry shifted. And it still boggles my mind that in the USA today, there is still debate on cannabis's medicinal value. we didn't need this recent shift from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 status to know that cannabis has a medicinal benefit. I mean, if it didn't, then why was it in the pharmacopoeia? Why were physicians using and prescribing it? And why were governments mandating it be grown? So again, at the end of the day, it's really ironic and a little bit ridiculous that, they made laws that it had to be grown and then they made laws against it. I never mentioned William B. O'Shaughnessy on the slide. I know we talked about him last time as well, but he was the Irish physician who had studied cannabis in India and then brought his knowledge to the USA. And it was when he did so that it became so widely used and accepted in America. All right, so in Canada, our first ever recorded hemp crop was planted by a settler, Louis Hebert. He was a Frenchman. He was an apothecary and a botanist who was good friends with explorer Samuel de Champlain. And around 1606, he planted the first cannabis crop in Canada in the area of Port Royal, which is now known as Nova Scotia. So hemp was, again, part of colonial survival because, you couldn't really build empires without hemp. Louis Hebert came to Canada on a ship, and once he settled, he did build relationships with the local people, local Indigenous leaders, including leaders like Mi'kmaq Chief Membertou and his family as well. It was actually reported that Louis Hebert treated Membertou's son, Actoded, who was dying, and did successfully save his life temporarily. He did later pass on, but that built a relationship between these two men. And Chief Membertou actually became the first Mi'kmaq chief to be baptized into Catholicism. And when he did so, he was given the English name Louis. There are also reports suggesting, that Indigenous peoples utilized cannabis again after it was introduced. And here's the clay pipe, the one we talked about from Morrison, Ontario. And there's also stories of the Wendat Huron people from that region. I got this from the Savory among the Hurons website, and they described that, hemp was used by the Huron-Wendat people for weaving, which they already did, were known to utilize these practices, weaving nettle fibers. And so it was suggested that they most likely used hemp as well. Okay, so we're going to dive into the pre-Prohibition era now. We're getting a little closer to it, and that starts particularly during the Mexican Revolution. And when, the information that I'm going to provide in the next few slides here, pay attention to the similar fate that I have noticed, and I noticed too, that Indigenous people and this plant have had, and the methods that they go to bring us down. It really is exemplified here in what happened during the Mexican Revolution. It was from 1910 to 1920, and during and after this time, immigration from Mexico into the United States increased dramatically, where almost 1 million people emigrated illegally over the border from Mexico into the U.S. With this, the Mexican people brought different cultures, including a cannabis smoking culture, into American public awareness. And cannabis was actually brought into Mexico by the Spanish, who also not only encouraged, but also imposed its cultivation by the Mexican people. So the Mexican communities were forced by the Spanish to grow cannabis and then began to utilize this plant that they were growing, and in particular because colonial rule prohibited them from using their own psychoactive medicines that they were used to. So because that was restricted, they started utilizing the cannabis plant, and they came up with this term marijuana as a form of coded language that would allow people to be able to use the plant and avoid attention from Spanish Catholic authorities. Now, the word itself originally was spelled with a J, and the Mary part is said to have been interpreted to mean of Mary. So some people believe that that implies reverence to the plant. But I have a different opinion, honestly, because they came up with this term to hide to hide the systems of control that were prohibiting their use of the plant. The term wasn't given to honor the plant, it was given to subjugate surveillance and to be able to maintain access to this plant under pressures. And then furthermore, the term marijuana became popularized by American prohibition campaigns, and that this is when the spelling of marijuana shifted as well. Spanish commonly used the J, but the English language newspapers and lawmakers changed it to an H, and they made the word look more foreign, unfamiliar, and threatening. And that was exactly the point, was to change the word and change the story. Cannabis was a scientific and medical term that was used in early texts and in pharmacy, and it carried the language of plant medicine, but the term marijuana, by contrast, was presented as something more foreign and unfamiliar. It was tied to anti-Mexican sentiment and used to frame the plant as dangerous. And this shift in language helped distance the plant from its medical history and began to associate it with fear and social threat. If anybody is familiar with the song La Cucaracha, I think we've all heard that at some point in our lives. This song came from the Mexican Revolution. It's said to reference one of its top revolutionaries, Pancho Villa. And in some versions of this song, it mentions marijuana. Now, this song was typically used politically and satirically, and the famous line of the song is that the cockroach cannot walk because it lacks marijuana to smoke. And, it sounds super silly, but prohibitionists and they use these cultural references, they lash onto them, and they use them to create a caricature of a lazy, dangerous, intoxicated Mexican. Sound familiar? Then came the stories of the Mexican local weed and newspaper hysteria that claimed cannabis caused madness, violence, and moral collapse. And of course, these narratives weren't grounded in any kind of scientific evidence. Nothing ever happened to encourage it. It was just, decision-based fact-making, shaping public opinion. And of course, the issue wasn't ever against the plant. This was a targeted attack against people. And it still persists today. Before I switch the slide to the little graphic at the bottom of, the sleeping Mexican, I remember this from my childhood. I swear I've probably even seen the same image. I remember seeing it in cartoons. I remember Speedy Gonzalez and his friend Slowpoke Rodriguez, I believe. And when I look back to that, I always think too that I think he was smoking the marijuana, and it was perpetuating this same kind of stigma of this persona. So I just found that interesting as well. Okay, so we're in Canada now. Back in Canada, I didn't realize this in 1923 that Canada was one of the countries that spearheaded Canada's prohibition. They just quietly, without debate, added cannabis to the Opium and Narcotic Drug Act through an amendment, and it placed it in the most restrictive category of Schedule 1, defining cannabis as having no medicinal value and a high potential for abuse. So this is 1923. All the thousands of years before that, it was medicine, it was sacrament, it was industry, and all of a sudden in 1923, it's no good, no more. What stands out again is that there was no scientific evidence, there was no irresponsible public use, there were no major studies, no medical consensus, and very little documented concern about cannabis at all. Again, it was just quietly added. And to understand why, you got to look at the climate at the time. Drug policy was already being shaped by fear and moral panic and racialized narratives, particularly around opium use in the Chinese communities in Canada around the early 1900s. Many Chinese laborers had come over to help build the railway. And when that work was finished, they were largely excluded from society. They faced discrimination. They had limited job opportunities, even had to pay a head tax. So they had very few options, very little support, and many of them ended up in opium dens. And that's when they became highly visible and heavily targeted. And these spaces were used to reinforce the fear-based narratives rather than, of course, to address the conditions that led the people there to the first place. And again, this 1923 prohibition came at the hands of a major cultural influential work. I actually brought my copy of the books on the table here. And it was a book called The Black Candle. It was written by Emily Murphy under the pen name Janie Canuck. Now, Emily Murphy was a prominent feminist, a suffragist. She was a judge, and she wrote articles for Maclean's magazine. And her book portrayed drug use as a threat to social order and linked it to racialized communities, particularly immigrants, and it framed substances like opium and cannabis as sources of moral decline, danger, and societal breakdown. Now, her writings on drugs reflected views that did reflect some of the thinking at the time, and it did have a little bit of a support for eugenics, which is something Hitler was also fond of, and it also had a strong anti-immigration sentiment. This racist and elitist mentality did contribute to a growing atmosphere of fear that helped to influence public opinion and policy. And this is how policy can shape form, not always from direct experience with a substance, but from the stories and assumptions that surround it. And this is where stigma lives. All right, this moment sets the stage for what follows. Once a substance is placed into a framework of fear and control, it becomes much easier to justify enforcement, prohibition, and stigma, even in the absence of clear evidence. And so after Canada did this in 1923 at the hands of William Lyon Mackenzie King, former prime minister, a few U.S. states followed suit. And then things got a little crazy in 1937 when it was just 4 years after the end of alcohol prohibition. They needed to give some guys some new jobs, so the United States passed the Marijuana Tax Act. And this act birthed the origin of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, headed by Commissioner Harry Anslinger, who was once the captain of the railroad. Now, the FBN, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, predates the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration that most of us know about today, by at least 3 decades, but it did lay much of the groundwork for federal drug enforcement. And at that time, a first offense came with a minimum sentence of 2 to 7 years with fines of up to $20,000 for as much as possession of a cannabis joint. And oddly enough, the Tax Act didn't necessarily make cannabis illegal, but what it did, like what I see happening right now with the Schedule III in the US, is that it created a tax and registration structure that was so restrictive that it effectively criminalized possession, transfer, and any outside use or any use outside of government approval. So again, no scientific basis or research that led to its implementation, merely political views and maneuvering that forced lawful producers to fill out impossible paperwork, pay the tax, register, and risk incriminating themselves in the future if they didn't maintain compliance. And funny enough, before the Marijuana Tax Act was implemented, the American Medical Association objected. They raised concerns about the lack of evidence, about the medical value of cannabis, and the fact that physicians had not been properly consulted. And they argued that cannabis was a medicine and shouldn't be handled through fear-based criminal law. But of course, those recommendations were ignored. And that's a pattern we still see today. Evidence ignored, patients ignored, plant knowledge and lived experience ignored. And then that's when propaganda fills the gap. And oddly enough, in 1969, 30 years after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Leary versus the United States ruled that parts of the Marijuana Tax Act violated the Fifth Amendment and was eventually declared unconstitutional. But by then, of course, the damage had already been done, and all it did was pave the way for some new laws and regulations, because we got the adoption of the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, which was followed by the Nixon administration's war on drugs. But the public had already been trained to fear the plant, And that fear campaign had a name, Free for Madness. All right, I want to see if I can get this to play. I'm afraid it's going to play. Oh, it's not going to play for you, though. Oh, no. So research in the past showed that, Black, Latino, and Indigenous people were disproportionately represented in cannabis arrests, even though they weren't using cannabis more than anybody else. There's actually a study as recently as 2024 that found that about 9% of Indigenous respondents reported being arrested or convicted for cannabis-related offenses, compared with about 4% of white respondents. Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of Canada's population, yet they make up roughly 30% or more of the people in federal custody, with some recent reports upping that number to about 1/3. And even after legalization, while cannabis charges dropped dramatically overall, racialized and Indigenous people remain overrepresented in the remaining criminal cases, and of course, reparations have yet to be made. And Prohibition was not only about restricting substances, it actually coincided with the expansion of American enforcement systems. So between 1930 and 1940, the number of federal prisons in the United States increased from 14 to 24. At the same time, many new drug policies increased arrests, prosecutions, and sentencing. And as laws broadened what counted as an offense, more and more people were brought into the system. And of course, this grows in this prison infrastructure, and the tightening of the policy, occurring simultaneously really does kind of bring about a chicken or the egg type of situation that leads us to later think about, what came first. Did they build the prisons and then create the laws to fill them up? Or was it the other way around? I think we know about the answer, but I'll leave that up to you. This history has led to a lot of barriers for Indigenous peoples to enter the legal market. Many of the people who were punished under Prohibition continue to face these barriers. If you've had a prior conviction, even for simple possession charge, it can restrict or delay entry. In many cases, record can affect your eligibility for licensing, for financing, for potential partnerships, and creates an immediate disadvantage even before the business begins. And then if you do gain access, well, that's great, but your barriers don't stop there, because the licensing is so costly and complex. The applications often require detailed documentation, compliance planning, security measures, and significant upfront capital. And then you have your ongoing maintenance costs, your taxation, your reporting requirements, your regulatory compliance, which is just creating further pressure, making it more and more difficult to sustain or scale business. As well, access to capital is another major challenge. Traditional lenders are often hesitant, of course, if you don't have existing wealth, financial backing. Many are unable to meet the financial demands that are required to operate in the legal space. So they're not making it easy for anybody out there, I'll tell you. We also have the patterns of over-policing, and that has a lasting effect. Communities that were heavily targeted under Prohibition often face this greater scrutiny, and this impacts business partnerships and the long-term stability of any business. And the result of this is a system where entry is limited, participation is uneven, and success is harder to achieve for those most impacted by Prohibition. And Indigenous communities have faced deeper justice barriers because of cannabis prohibition. And cannabis prohibition's goal originated in controlling racialized communities, suppressing sovereignty, and enforcing white European social norms. And because of this, Indigenous offenders were most likely to serve longer portions of sentences and to face lower parole grant rates. And recent reporting points directly to systemic racism, supervision conditions, and parole disparities as ongoing factors as to why Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in custody. But who has benefited while others waited for permission to profit? It's our federal government, of course. Okay, this is last slide. I just want to share a little bit about our relationship, and it comes through our language. With as Indigenous peoples, our plant names do carry relationship. They're not just labels. They often tell us what a plant does, where it belongs, how it behaves, and how we as a people relate to it. And the history that we have with this plant, it's sorted, it's varied, but we do have language that spans various cultures. And again, our language is based on representation rather than alliteration. So the fact that we even have these words and their meaning proves at least we have an awareness, and it does dictate some of our past relationship with the plant. And you can see that it varies from place to place. A lot of them are positive. We even see the one, needing bad smoke. This is our relationship. So what we know for sure is across all the four corners of the globe for countless millennia, this plant was sacred before it was stigmatized. It was medicine before it was criminalized. It was agriculture before it was controlled, and humans worked with it in relationship. And this was before the past 80 years or so, where rich men in tall buildings told us that we can't. So, I find it really odd that now that in the U.S. they're saying that they agree, and many are applauding and cheering this switch from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. But in my eyes, the pattern recognition is really clear. More regulation equals more taxation equals more control. And this is why maintaining sovereignty is so very important. This plant has never betrayed us. Only the story about her did. But with more knowledge and understanding, less stigma, we can tell another story. We could tell a better story. So that's it for me tonight. Yahweh, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time and attention. Really appreciate everyone for being here. And if you have any questions, I will gladly take them now.